Welcome back to the deep dive. If you're new here, we're your hosts, Anna and Eric, and every week we unpack one of the biggest, most complex, and most misunderstood topics shaping the life sciences industry.
Today, we're stepping into one of the most explosive, fast-moving intersections of technology and healthcare, the regulatory future of AI companions and virtual therapeutics.
And let's be honest, this space is growing faster than the rules that govern it. What started as simple chatbot wellness apps has evolved into advanced AI companions that monitor symptoms, deliver therapy, guide medication adherence, and adapt to patients in real time.
Right. We're talking about AI that acts almost like a digital care partner, supporting patients with chronic disease management, mental health, rehabilitation, even lifestyle interventions. And the big question is, when does this cross the line from general wellness into regulated medical device territory?
Exactly. That's the $1 million question. Because once an AI system claims to diagnose, treat, mitigate, or prevent a condition, even indirectly, you're entering FDA software as a medical device territory, and the rules change dramatically.
What makes this space particularly tricky is the diversity of products. Some AI companions are passive. They check in, offer reminders, provide educational content. Others adjust therapy based on patient behavior. Some deliver cognitive behavioral therapy modules. Some assist clinicians with decision support. And then you have virtual therapeutics that are prescribed just like a drug, reimbursed like a drug, and tracked like a drug.
Which is wild because 10 years ago, that idea didn't even exist. Now we've got FDA cleared digital therapeutics for ADHD, opioid use disorder, insomnia, and companies are developing AI versions that are more immersive, more adaptive, and more personalized.
But with that innovation comes complexity. Regulators are trying to make sure these tools are safe, unbiased, clinically validated, and secure, without slowing innovation to a crawl. And that's one of the biggest challenges with AI-driven tools. They evolve.
Right. Traditional software is static. Version 1 stays version 1 until someone updates it. But AI companions learn from users and update themselves. This could mean the algorithm you validated at submission won't behave the same way 6 months later.
Exactly why the FDA is working on frameworks like the Predetermined Change Control Plan, PCCP, which basically allows companies to predefine how their AI model can change over time and under what guardrails. But that's still early in practice, especially for emotionally responsive AI companions.
And that brings us to one of the biggest regulatory puzzles. AI companions often sit in a gray zone. If an AI system says something like, I'm here to support your mental wellness today, that's wellness. But if it says, let me guide you through a therapeutic module to treat anxiety, that's clinical. And often companies don't realize how small that line is.
And the other wrinkle is patient perception. Even if you design an AI tool as a wellness companion, if users believe it's providing medical advice, the FDA can still regulate it based on intended use, inferred through marketing, UI, or real-world use.
Absolutely. Intent isn't just what you write in your labeling, it's what the product actually does and how patients behave with it.
And here's where virtual therapeutics raise the stakes, because unlike wellness apps, these tools must demonstrate clinical benefit. You're looking at pivotal trials, human factors testing, cybersecurity validation, and real-world evidence generation. The regulatory burden looks a lot more like a traditional medical device, just with software instead of hardware.
And speaking of cybersecurity, AI companions are data heavy. They rely on continuous input, they store sensitive details, and their functionality depends on cloud connectivity. FDA is already signaling that cybersecurity maturity will be a core requirement for future AI based therapeutics.
And let's not forget about bias. If your AI companion adapts differently across demographic groups because of skewed training data, regulators will treat that as a safety risk, not a technical glitch.
Now we're going to break down three things: how regulators classify AI companions and what triggers SAMD oversight, the clinical validation expectations for virtual therapeutics, and where global regulators, FDA, EMA, MHRA, are aligning and diverging on AI guidance.
But before we go there, I think we should touch on why AI companions are exploding in the first place.
Absolutely. It's simple demand. Patients want continuous support, clinicians want tools that extend care, and payers want scalable interventions that reduce long term costs. AI companions offer all three.
And unlike traditional care models, these systems can be available 24/7, personalized, and highly scalable, which makes them incredibly attractive to health systems.
So the industry is moving fast. The question is whether regulation can keep up.
Let's dive deeper into that question of regulation keeping pace, because what we're really seeing is a tug of war between innovation and oversight. Companies are building tools that feel more interactive, more human, and more clinically meaningful. But regulators still need clear, predictable frameworks to evaluate them.
And one thing that's becoming clear is that AI companions aren't all created equal. Some act like supportive digital friends, others behave more like adaptive therapists, and some essentially function as clinical decision support tools. Each of those categories carries different regulatory expectations.
Exactly. Think about an AI companion that checks in on your mood every morning and offers simple affirmations. Low risk, likely stays in wellness. But now imagine an AI that analyzes your tone of voice or typing patterns, detects signs of depression, and recommends an intervention. That's a diagnostic function. Totally different risk profile.
And regulators are already signaling that sentiment analysis, emotion classification, and behavioral prediction models will require much more rigorous validation because they influence patient decision making.
And that leads into clinical validation. For virtual therapeutics that claim to treat a condition, regulators want evidence that they work in real world environments. Digital health clinical trials have been evolving quickly, but AI introduces new challenges. Controlling for training drift, ensuring consistency across versions, and measuring outcomes that may be behavioral rather than physiological.
And here's where a lot of companies underestimate the lift. You're not just proving the content works, you're proving the algorithmic adaptation works. Because if your therapeutic model changes based on user behavior, you have to demonstrate that those adaptations don't degrade safety or effectiveness.
Right. And that's where FDA's PCCP idea comes into play, because regulators want advanced transparency on what changes are allowed, how they'll be monitored, and what performance metrics trigger revalidation.
But that's still evolving, especially for products that have real time interaction and emotional dynamics. AI companions aren't static tools, they build relationships with users. That creates a new ethical and regulatory dimension.
And speaking of ethics, there's a huge question around dependency. If an AI companion becomes a primary emotional support mechanism, what happens when it goes down for maintenance? What happens if the model shifts? Regulators are starting to look at the human factor's implications of reliance.
That's such an important point. This isn't like a broken step counter. If someone relies on an AI companion for anxiety reduction or adherence reminders, system outages or algorithmic errors can have real world consequences. Software availability, latency, and stability suddenly become safety factors.
And another layer, transparency. Do patients actually understand when they're interacting with AI versus automated scripts versus clinical content? Regulators are asking companies to disclose the nature of the interaction clearly. Some agencies are even exploring labeling requirements for AI generated insights.
And globally, we're starting to see divergence. The EU's AI Act, for example, treats many of these tools as high risk systems if they can influence health decisions. That triggers strict documentation, human oversight requirements, and continuous monitoring expectations.
Compare that to the FDA, which tends to be risk based and evidence driven. They allow more flexibility, especially under enforcement discretion, but they're also pushing for guardrails. EMA is somewhere in between, more structured than the US, less prescriptive than the AI Act.
So, if a company wants to commercialize globally, the regulatory strategy becomes incredibly complex. You have to design your AI companion in a way that meets multiple frameworks simultaneously: transparency, security, data privacy, clinical validation, human oversight.
And that's why early regulatory engagement is becoming essential. FDA has been encouraging pre-submissions for digital tools, especially AI-based therapeutics. It helps companies understand whether they're viewed as wellness, device, or full-on therapeutic.
And it prevents surprises. No one wants to invest millions into development only to learn the tool requires a much higher regulatory burden than expected.
Another thing we should talk about is real-world evidence. For AI-driven therapeutics, regulators see RWE as a critical part of life cycle evaluation. These tools change over time, patient populations shift, and long-term use patterns may reveal new insights.
And that requires continuous monitoring, not just during clinical trials, but across the entire product lifecycle. Usage data, dropout rates, adverse behavioral responses, algorithmic anomalies. Companies will be expected to track and report all of it.
Which means building a post-market surveillance system that looks a lot more like what you'd see for a high-risk medical device, even if the software itself seems simple on the surface.
And that's honestly where many startups stumble. They focus on building the coolest user experience or most advanced AI model, but they don't invest in the infrastructure, quality systems, risk management, cybersecurity, maturity, data governance.
Exactly. And without those systems, regulators won't clear the product, payers won't reimburse it, and clinicians won't trust it.
Now we're going to get into the heart of the issue. What does a strong regulatory strategy actually look like for AI companions in virtual therapeutics? What are regulators really expecting? And how can companies design for both innovation and compliance from day one?
Yeah, so let's dig into what a strong regulatory strategy actually looks like, because this is where a lot of companies get tripped up. They assume that if the AI works well in user testing, it'll automatically be ready for FDA review. But regulators don't evaluate performance the way consumer tech companies do.
Exactly. FDA wants to see structured evidence, clear risk classification, intended use definitions, human factors analysis, and clinical validation. But before any of that, they want clarity on the problem the AI is solving. An AI companion that aims to reduce mild anxiety is very different from one that claims to support treatment of generalized anxiety disorder.
And that intended use statement is everything. It determines which regulatory pathway you're in, what evidence you need, what risks you must mitigate, and how the product will be evaluated long term. If companies get it wrong early, they end up redesigning half the product later.
And on top of that, AI companions often blur categories. They combine behavioral support, nudging, coaching, data interpretation, and emotional interaction. That makes the risk analysis more complex. Regulators want developers to map out not just functional risks, but interpersonal and psychological risks too.
Right. Things like misinterpretation of user intent, emotional dependency, or over-reliance on algorithmic recommendations. With virtual therapeutics, the hazard analysis must include potential impacts on mental health, not just technical failures.
And let's talk about transparency again, because FDA and EMA are really pushing this. Companies need to show how the system makes decisions, not necessarily revealing proprietary algorithms, but giving regulators visibility into the logic, triggers, and thresholds that influence outputs.
And that ties into algorithm change protocols. If the AI companion updates its model weekly or monthly, regulators want a predefined plan outlining which changes are low risk, which require revalidation, and which need regulatory notification. It's like creating a roadmap for the AI's evolution.
And companies can't rely on vague descriptions. FDA wants specifics. What data sources train the model? How is bias mitigated? How is drift detected? How is corrective action triggered? These details matter because they influence safety and performance over time.
Cybersecurity is another massive concern. Because these tools interact frequently, daily, sometimes hourly, they generate sensitive behavioral and emotional data. Regulators expect encryption, intrusion detection, authentication layers, and resilience plans for outages.
And outage planning is surprisingly important. If your AI companion is functioning as a support tool for anxiety, stress, or adherence, users depend on stability. Regulators want to see how the system fails safely. what messages users receive, what backup resources are provided, how the platform maintains continuity.
What's interesting is that this blends traditional medical device risk management with behavioral science. Companies must consider not just whether the software fails, but how the failure affects the user emotionally or clinically.
And then there's clinical validation itself. For virtual therapeutics, randomized controlled trials may still play a role, but regulators are increasingly open to alternative designs like decentralized trials, adaptive designs, or hybrid RWE supported trials.
Which is great news for developers, but it also raises expectations. If the AI adapts, you might need to validate multiple states of the algorithm. Regulators want evidence that the therapeutic effect is durable, not just a one-time behavioral boost that fades after a few weeks.
And this is where engagement metrics matter. Drop off rates, user adherence, time in app. These can correlate directly to therapeutic effectiveness. Regulators look at them as indicators of sustainability.
Add to that the global complexity. Companies hoping to expand into Europe, Canada, or Asia need to evaluate entirely different frameworks. The EU tends to be stricter about data governance and algorithm accountability, while the US takes a more flexible, risk-based approach.
Right. And countries like Japan and Australia are developing digital health pathways that emphasize long term monitoring and post market reporting. So, a global strategy means harmonizing documentation, evidence, and life cycle plans across multiple systems.
And this is why early planning is crucial. If a company waits until the product is fully built to think about regulation, they'll end up redoing their architecture, documentation, and risk assessments. But if they design with compliance in mind, the process becomes much smoother.
Another piece companies need to consider is integration with clinical workflows. Even if the AI companion is patient facing, regulators may ask, how does it communicate with clinicians? How is data handed off? What warnings or alerts are triggered for high risk scenarios?
And clinicians themselves need to trust the tool. If they don't understand how the AI works, they won't recommend it. Regulatory clearance can open the door, but provider confidence determines adoption.
So, when we put all of this together, intended use clarity, risk management, algorithm change protocols, cybersecurity, clinical validation, and global strategy, we're really talking about a full life cycle approach. AI companions aren't one time submissions, they are evolving therapeutic ecosystems.
And for developers, that means building systems that are resilient, explainable, and continuously monitored. It's a bigger challenge than traditional SAMD, but it's also where the field is heading.
Now, we'll walk through what companies can do right now from day zero to build AI companions and virtual therapeutics that meet regulatory expectations without stifling innovation. These are practical steps that can save years of redevelopment.
So let's shift into something really practical. What companies need to build from day one if they want to survive regulatory review? Because at this point, building an AI companion without a regulatory strategy is like building a plane midair.
Absolutely. And the first thing companies need is a structured documentation framework, not something improvised later, not a half done Notion page. Regulators want traceability, design decisions, risk analyses, data sources, testing protocols, and user feedback loops. If that traceability isn't established early, the evidence becomes messy and hard to defend.
And that includes version control. Too many digital health startups forget that regulators don't just evaluate the current version, they want the entire evolution of the system. What changed? Why did it change? Was the impact assessed? If the AI is learning, is it learning safely?
That's where change impact analysis comes in. Developers need to categorize updates before they ever happen. For example, interface improvements might be low risk, but adjustments to the therapeutic algorithm could require revalidation. A mature company prepares these rules in advance instead of scrambling during review.
Something else we need to talk about is human factors. Traditional SAMD developers already understand this, but AI companions take it to another level. Because they often mimic human conversation or emotional support. That means usability testing must address not just functionality, but psychological dynamics.
Right. Companies should be asking questions like, does the user interpret the AI's tone correctly? Does the AI accidentally imply a clinical diagnosis? Could users misunderstand humor, empathy prompts, or suggestions for behavioral change? Regulators care deeply about these subtleties.
And that becomes even more essential when AI companions are interacting with high risk populations. Teens, elderly users, individuals with anxiety or depression, these groups require tailored risk mitigation, not a one size fits all interface.
Another area companies underestimate is data labeling and dataset governance. Regulators are increasingly requesting transparency about training data, where it came from, how it was cleaned, what biases were detected and corrected. If the data isn't representative, the outputs won't be either.
And FDA has already warned developers an AI that performs well in one demographic but poorly in another can be considered unsafe. That means companies need to evaluate performance across age, gender, ethnicity, cultural background, and sometimes even language proficiency.
Exactly. And this gets into benchmarking. Developers should not wait for FDA to ask for comparisons. They should proactively test their AI against validated scales, established therapeutic frameworks, or clinician led assessments. It shows regulators that the AI's approach is grounded, not improvised.
And then comes another huge topic guardrails. AI companions need strict boundaries for what they can say or recommend. If a user expresses severe distress, self harm ideation, or dangerous clinical symptoms, the AI must respond with validated crisis protocols, not generic coaching language.
And regulators absolutely expect those guardrails. They want to see escalation pathways, emergency messaging, and referral mechanisms. What hotline does the AI provide? What disclaimers? What triggers an automated freeze of conversational features?
And here's the challenging part developers must document how those guardrails were tested. It's not enough to write crisis scripts. Regulators expect validation. Did real users test these scenarios? Did the AI respond consistently? Were false positives or false negatives recorded? How did the team refine the model?
And as these tools go global, the complexity multiplies. Crisis pathways differ by country. Medical terminology differs. Even what is considered therapeutic guidance differs. A phrase that's safe in the US might be considered clinical overreach in the EU.
The global regulatory strategy really becomes a puzzle, especially because some regulators, like those in the EU, require conformity assessment through notified bodies, which means a deeper dive into risk files and quality management. Others, like in Asia, may emphasize post market surveillance instead.
And that brings us to another major requirement, a post market performance plan. AI companions are dynamic. They learn, they adjust, user populations shift. Regulators want companies to monitor drift, update their risk files regularly, conduct ongoing user studies, and keep detailed logs of all updates.
It's no longer enough to say, the model works today. You need a plan for how it will remain safe 6 months, 1 year, 3 years from now.
And that's where having a strong QMS matters. A lot of digital health startups try to bypass quality management because they think it will slow them down. In reality, a modern digital health QMS is what protects the company's speed because it creates a predictable, auditable structure for making changes.
Exactly. A company with good documentation, validated processes, and strong governance can iterate faster than a company that has to redo half its system before every regulatory review.
And maybe we should talk about an emerging conversation we're seeing in the field, the idea of digital bedside manner. Regulators are starting to think about how AI personality, tone, and conversational flow affect patient safety.
Yes, because if the AI companion is too assertive, users may overtrust it. If it's too passive, users may ignore important nudges. If it sounds too human, it might create emotional dependency. And if it sounds too robotic, the therapeutic impact may drop.
All of that becomes part of the safety profile. Companies building AI companions need multidisciplinary teams, not just engineers and data scientists, but behavioral psychologists, clinicians, UX researchers, and compliance experts.
In other words, regulatory success isn't about having the smartest algorithm, it's about having the safest system.
Now, we'll go deeper into how companies can align innovation with compliance without slowing down product development, and we'll break down practical strategies that keep AI companions scalable, safe, and regulator ready.
Before we wrap up, there's one more layer we need to explore: the business side. Because even if a company builds a safe, compliant AI companion, it won't survive unless it can navigate reimbursement, payer expectations, and provider adoption.
Right. And payers are asking harder questions than ever. They want proof that these tools actually improve outcomes. Does the AI reduce provider burden? Does it increase adherence? Can it demonstrate measurable clinical benefit? These metrics are becoming just as important as regulatory approval.
And what's interesting is that AI companions and virtual therapeutics are starting to fall into this new hybrid space between traditional SAMD and behavioral health tools. That means companies need to think beyond FDA clearance. They need evidence that supports reimbursement, evidence that convinces health systems to integrate the tool into real workflows.
Exactly. A doctor isn't going to recommend an AI companion unless it has clear clinical purpose, clear boundaries, and a clear regulatory status. And patients won't trust it unless they know how it works, how it protects their data, and what it's actually allowed to do.
And that puts communication front and center. Companies need transparent user disclosures, not buried policies, not vague marketing language. Regulators are starting to expect plain language statements explaining what the AI can and cannot do.
This transparency also builds trust. When users understand how the AI makes decisions, how their data is handled, and when the system hands off to a human, the entire experience becomes safer and more grounded.
And that leads us straight into the future, because everything we've talked about, guardrails, drift management, crisis protocols, global regulatory pathways, all of that is evolving. Regulators aren't just catching up, they're actively shaping what safe AI in healthcare looks like.
Yes, and what we're watching right now is the birth of a brand new regulatory discipline. 5 years from now, AI companions won't feel like an experimental category. They'll be part of mainstream digital therapeutics, but with much clearer rules.
And developers who build with compliance and safety as part of their DNA will have a huge advantage. They'll be able to move faster, scale globally, and build trust with regulators and users alike.
So here's the bottom line: AI companions and virtual therapeutics aren't just another tech trend. They're reshaping how patients experience care. They're extending the clinician's reach, filling gaps in behavioral health, supporting chronic disease management, and personalizing treatment in real time.
But with that opportunity comes responsibility. The companies that succeed will be the ones that treat regulation not as a roadblock, but as a roadmap.
And that's where Emma International comes in, because navigating this space requires more than a brilliant engineering team. It requires people who understand FDA expectations, global regulatory strategies, quality management, clinical risk, and real world implementation.
Exactly. Whether it's developing SAMD, documenting AI behavior, preparing for a 510K, or building a lifecycle post-market plan, companies need experienced partners who can bridge technical innovation with regulatory strategy.
And as AI keeps evolving, more conversation, more autonomy, more integration with wearable data, the regulatory bar will only get higher. And that's why getting it right early is the real competitive advantage.
So, as we close out this episode, here's the key takeaway: AI companions and virtual therapeutics can transform healthcare, but only if they're built with safety, transparency, and compliance at the core.
Innovation doesn't slow down because of regulation, it becomes stronger, more credible, and more sustainable.
And if your organization is beginning to explore this space, or if you're already developing an AI driven tool and need guidance on regulatory pathways, validation strategies, or quality systems, Emma International is here to help. You can reach us anytime at info@emmainternational.com or visit emmainternational.com to learn more.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back with another episode exploring the intersection of innovation, regulation, and the future of life sciences.
Until next time, stay curious, stay compliant, and stay innovative.